It was not by any estimation an eventful Tuesday. The Reverend Cyril Swithin had begun it with porridge of his own making, a habit born less of thrift than of mistrust in Mrs. Harker's punctuality, and followed with his customary inspection of the churchyard. The morning was mild, the air faintly scented by lilac and disinfectant. He noted without pleasure that someone had again left plastic flowers on Mrs. Trenholme's grave, a practice he considered both impious and suburban. The Reverend's chief business of the morning lay within the vestry. It was his intention to prepare the register of recent marriages for the Archdeacon's review, and to that end he fetched the large brass key from its nail beside the umbrella stand. The key turned with a sound suggesting mild protest. The vestry was as it ever was, dim, cool, and faintly redolent of hymnals. Dust fell in lazy columns through the window light, and the air bore the faint trace of camphor, a smell the Reverend associated with Mrs. Cribbins, who kept the parish records and herself in comparable condition. He crossed to the oak cupboard where the ledgers were kept. The doors were ajar, no more than a finger's width, but enough to disturb the settled impression of ecclesiastical order. For a moment he wondered whether he had left it so himself. He could not recall doing so, and this uncertainty troubled him more than the fact itself. Inside, the ledgers stood upright in their accustomed order: marriages, baptisms, burials, churchwardens' accounts, parish council minutes, and the slim, unlovely volume of miscellaneous correspondence. But the baptisms register was not where it should have been. It had slipped sideways, half pulled from its shelf, and several loose sheets had fallen beneath it. One corner of the cover was damp, perhaps from the vestry's ill-fitting window, though it had not rained for several days. The Reverend adjusted his spectacles and peered closer. A sheet of parchment protruded awkwardly, torn from its binding. The name written upon it, faintly in brown ink, was vain. The date beside it, 1922, he replaced the paper with more delicacy than necessary and stood motionless for several seconds. There was, he felt, something improper about even touching it. Then, recovering a sense of clerical authority, he closed the cupboard firmly and locked it. Outside, the bell for 10:30 startled him with its assertiveness. It was followed, as always, by the distant rattle of Mrs. Birkett's bicycle over the churchyard path. Within minutes she entered the porch, carrying a basket, and her habitual expression of civic alarm. "Good morning, Vicar. I thought I'd just look in to see if the flowers had been properly arranged after Sunday." "I am sure they were, Mrs. Birkett." "Well, one does like to make certain. People do notice these things." She looked around, her gaze alighting on the vestry door, as though scenting some small administrative irregularity. The Reverend moved instinctively to block the view. "Everything quite in order?" she asked sweetly. "Quite. Merely some rearrangement of papers. Nothing of consequence." She smiled, the expression of a woman who has been told precisely the wrong amount of truth. "Oh, I do understand. So much to keep track of. Records, secrets, and such like." He inclined his head, unwilling to dignify that with reply. By luncheon, half of Flaxborough was aware that something odd had been found in the church. Mrs. Birkett's fidelity to accuracy was exceeded only by her devotion to circulation. Thus, when Inspector Purbright received a telephone message from the Reverend at 2:00, it was not the first he had heard of the matter. Inspector Perbrite arrived discreetly by way of the north gate, accompanied by Sergeant Love, whose quiet tread suggested experience in approaching skittish clergy. The Reverend greeted them at the vestry door with an air of apology more than concern. "I feel certain it is nothing criminal, Inspector," he said, leading them inside. "Merely some confusion, yet Mrs. Cribbins insists that I inform the authorities Whenever a parish record is disturbed, she takes the matter rather to heart. Purbright smiled mildly. It is always best, sir, to err on the side of dullness. The Reverend looked faintly reassured, as though dullness might indeed be the preferred moral state. He produced the key and opened the cupboard. The smell of camphor was stronger now, not unpleasant, but insistent, like the perfume of a memory. Perbrite examined the ledgers without touching them. His gaze lingered on the baptisms volume. "May I?" "Of course, though I would ask you to handle it carefully. The spine is fragile." Perbrite lifted it to the table and turned a few pages with a finger of deliberate gentleness. The handwriting varied over decades, from florid to timid. "This one seems to have been kept rather longer than most." "It dates from 1891, said the Reverend, with a pride that almost concealed anxiety. Purbright reached the page where the torn sheet belonged. The gap was unmistakable. A faint impression of handwriting remained upon the adjacent page, enough to suggest that the missing entry had once been genuine. "Do you happen to recall any recent use of this volume, sir?" The Reverend shook his head. "None, Inspector. Mrs. Cribbins manages all routine references. I myself seldom open these except at audit." "Would anyone else have access to the key?" "Well, the curate, naturally, and the verger, possibly the organist, though that would be irregular, and I believe Mr. Vane, as churchwarden, retains a duplicate for emergencies." Purbright's expression remained composed, but the faintest light of interest entered his eyes. "Mr. Harold Vane, the gentleman who financed the restoration of the South Transept?" "The same. A generous fellow." "Most certainly," said the Reverend, though his tone made generosity sound vaguely immodest. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, had discovered the torn scrap upon the floor. He handed it to Perbrite with the cautious pride of one offering evidence to his superior. The inspector studied it. "Vane," he murmured. "Baptized 1922? "Yes," said the Reverend stiffly. "A name of long local standing." "Indeed." Perbrite returned the fragment to the table. "Curious thing, sir. Names. They tend to persist where facts perish." The Reverend said nothing, which was sensible. Later, as they walked together across the churchyard, Perbrite paused beside the lichened bench near the lich gate. The afternoon had settled into that particular stillness peculiar to small towns between scandal and tea. "Odd business," said Love tentatively. "Yes," Perbrite agreed, "though perhaps not so odd as it appears. Things in cupboards rarely are." "You think it's just misfiling, then?" "Possibly, but people seldom misfile what they wish to remember." Love nodded, though without full comprehension. His thoughts were occupied with the name Vane, which he associated with the large white house at the edge of the town, the one with the overgrown tennis court and the air of suppressed comfort. Perbrite seemed to read this thought, for he added mildly, "You might, when convenient, ascertain whether Mr. Vane has taken any particular interest in church matters of late. Quietly, of course. A misplaced baptism is not yet a crime." "No, sir?" They walked on, their steps soft among the graves. A robin perched briefly upon a headstone, then flew off with a reproachful flick. The Reverend, left alone, returned to the vestry. He wished, quite irrationally, to reassure himself that all was again in order. He unlocked the cupboard, straightened the ledgers, and stood regarding them as one might stand before a row of witnesses of uncertain loyalty. He considered, for the first time, telephoning Mr. Vane, not to accuse, but to inquire. Yet the thought of that conversation dissuaded him. Mr. Vane possessed a tone of affable certainty that left no space for clerical ambiguity. The Reverend felt unequal to it. Instead, he sat at the small writing table and began to compose a note to Mrs. Cribbins, requesting her to inspect all records for signs of misplacement or tampering. His pen hesitated over the second word, which seemed unduly sensational, but he left it. She would appreciate the gravity. As he sealed the envelope, he noticed a faint residue of dust upon his sleeve, dust of a kind not native to the vestry. Grey, granular, with a slight glint. He brushed it off absently, though it clung. Perhaps from the cupboard hinge, perhaps from the crypt stairs which he had not visited in years. The thought struck him oddly. Who, indeed, had been in the crypt lately? He locked the cupboard once more firmly than before, and drew the curtains across the vestry window. The smell of camphor lingered, as if some unseen hand had left it there as a signature. Outside, the bell tolled 4. It was an innocent sound, but to the reverend it seemed curiously deliberate, as though announcing a matter that the world would soon pretend not to notice. He removed his spectacles, polished them, and looked once more at the locked cupboard. There was, he told himself, nothing there that need disturb anyone, but the faintest flicker of unease remained, not guilt exactly, but the uneasy sense that something long buried had begun, in its mild and clerical way, to stir. And in the hush that followed the bell, the air of the vestry seemed very slightly colder. The offices of the parish clerk were situated with appropriate modesty above the cooperative drapery. The stairs, narrow and carpetless, conveyed an impression of moral rather than architectural purpose. One climbed them not for comfort, but in order to be reminded of one's duties. At the top, Inspector Purbright removed his hat and allowed his eyes to adjust to the dim light that filtered through an upright window frosted with grime and civic virtue. Mrs. Cribbins, who ruled this small domain, looked up from her writing table with a startled dignity that implied she had been expecting no one, least of all the law. Her spectacles caught the light like the eyes of a reproachful owl. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cribbins." Perbrite inclined his head in a gesture halfway between courtesy and inquiry. "I'm sorry to intrude upon your industry." "Well," said Mrs. Cribbins after a pause, suggesting that intrusion was her natural element. "One does try to maintain the appearance of industry, Inspector. It discourages casual conversation." "Admirable," said Perbrite. "I've come about the parish records." Mrs. Cribbins set her pen precisely parallel to her blotter. "Ah, the reverend has been in contact, I assume?" "He has, yes. He seemed perturbed by a certain disorder in the vestry cupboard. I gather you have some responsibility for those documents." Her lips pressed together in a manner that might have been assent. "For over 30 years, Inspector, and never once a discrepancy until now." Perbrite nodded sympathetically. "You must feel the violation keenly." "I do not care for melodramatic words, Inspector, but yes, I do." The office contained, besides its occupant and the furniture, a quantity of moral atmosphere, the kind that grows dense when one person believes herself indispensable to the preservation of decency. The air smelled faintly of sealing wax, strong tea, and paper, long folded. "Tell me," said Perbrite, "have you noticed anything irregular among the records lately? Missing items, strange requests, that sort of thing?" Mrs. Cribbins folded her hands upon the desk. "The only irregularity, Inspector, is the modern attitude toward secrecy. People imagine that records are their personal property. They are not. They belong to the parish, and by extension, to God." "Indeed," said Perbrite, with an air of mild submission. "Only last month," she continued, "Mr. Vane demanded to see the baptism register for 1922. I told him that was outside the scope of his office. He seemed annoyed, though I dare say men of means are not used to being refused. Perbrite looked up politely. "Mr. Harold Vane?" "The same. He's a generous man, no doubt, but generosity is not the same thing as propriety." "Quite so." Mrs. Cribbins regarded him, as if weighing whether a policeman could appreciate the subtleties of parochial life. "I am not suggesting, Inspector, that Mr. Vane intended mischief. Still, one wonders why a churchwarden should wish to consult a record so old." "One does," Purbright agreed. "He asked to see the minute book of the parish council, and she fetched it with reverence. The ledger was a monument to patience, its edges darkened by generations of hands. Purbright turned the pages slowly, pausing now and then to read the elegant copperplate of long-dead secretaries who had managed, somehow, to combine civic duty with literary restraint. "May I?" he asked, indicating the latest entries. "Certainly," she said, though she hovered like a mother over an ailing child. The last meeting recorded concerned the Church Restoration Fund. Perbrite read aloud, "Mr. Harold Vane proposed that a portion of the surplus be applied to the purchase of a new organ stool, provided this was done in a spirit of commemoration." He looked up. "A touching spirit, that." Mrs. Cribbins' mouth twitched. "It was touching to some, Inspector. Others considered it theatrical." "And was the proposal carried?" "It was deferred," she said after a pause. "The Reverend thought the gesture premature." Perbrite closed the book gently. "I imagine discussions of parish expenditure can become rather spirited." Her expression softened, as though in memory of something almost human. "They can, especially when benefactors feel their benefactions inadequately acknowledged." Perbrite smiled. "I suppose one must manage gratitude as one manages a budget, with tactful economy." "That is well put, Inspector." The compliment was offered as if he had passed a minor moral examination. He took a few moments to glance about the office, while Mrs. Cribbins busied herself with the tea tray that had appeared from nowhere. The room was small but immaculate. Even the waste-paper basket seemed to contain only approved forms of disorder, trimmed margins and rejected drafts folded with remorseful neatness. "I notice you keep carbon copies of the minutes," Perbrite said. "Of course, one cannot rely on memory, Inspector, even mine." "Do you keep them here?" "In the cabinet, under lock and key." "And the key?" She smiled thinly. "Always upon my person." Perbrite's gaze flicked to the chain attached to her belt. It was ornate for such a purpose. An heirloom, perhaps, or a declaration of continuity. He said nothing further. Mrs. Cribbins poured the tea in silence, her movements slow and deliberate. When she spoke again, her tone had softened to that of reluctant confidence. "You will think me fanciful, Inspector, but I sometimes believe the parish records possess a life of their own. They seem to breathe the character of those who wrote in them. One feels their presence. The vicars, the wardens, even the gossipers who lodged complaints." "I can imagine," said Perbrite, sipping. "A kind of moral archaeology." "Yes," she said, pleased. "Each entry a fossil of intention." Perbrite let the words rest in the air a moment. Then he asked, almost idly, "Did you ever know a Mrs. Vane? The present Mr. Vane's wife?" "Oh, yes, a gracious lady, if rather melancholy." "She no longer attends the services regularly? Poor health, I believe." "Ah." Mrs. Cribbins hesitated, as if to weigh propriety against satisfaction. "There were whispers some years ago about her absence from communion, but I pay no heed to whispers. They blow in through keyholes and out through vestry doors." "Quite," said Perbrite, "and yet they often leave a little dust behind." Her mouth twitched again, not displeased, merely cautious. The Reverend has been a good deal more tolerant than his predecessor, you know. A sensible man. But tolerance has its risks. Purbright smiled faintly. Tolerance often disguises fatigue. Indeed. They talked for some minutes about procedural details, where the records were stored, how often they were inspected, and by whom. Each answer came neatly packaged, yet beneath the clerk's precision ran a small undercurrent of resentment, as if the entire world had lately become less reliable. Before leaving, Perbrite asked to see the pen with which she signed the minutes. She handed it over at once, a heavy, old-fashioned fountain pen of black enamel. "An elegant instrument," he remarked. "It belonged to my predecessor, Mr. Pottle. He believed a poor pen was a moral hazard. Very sound doctrine. He examined the nib, then the ink pot beside it. You keep your inkwell remarkably clean, Mrs. Cribbins." She seemed uncertain whether this was praise or suspicion. Naturally, ink accumulates unpleasantly if neglected. "Of course. I ask only because the Reverend mentioned you had not been writing recently." Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I may not have written minutes, Inspector, but there are other forms of correspondence. Parish life demands much ink, little gratitude." Perbrite nodded, accepting the reproof. "Then I am reassured. The Archdeacon, I gather, intends to review all recent entries. I am sure he will find them impeccable. I'm sure he will." Outside, the late afternoon light lay flat across the high street. The inspector and Sergeant Love descended the stairs, each step a mild protest from the timber beneath. "Well," said Love, when they reached the pavement, "she doesn't strike me as the sort to misplace papers." "No," said Perbrite, adjusting his hat, "nor the sort to forgive those who do." They began walking toward the station. Perbrite's pace was unhurried, his gaze seemingly aimless, yet his thoughts moved with quiet precision. "Do you think she's hiding something?" Love asked. "Possibly," Perbrite replied, "but in Flaxborough one must distinguish between hiding something and simply minding one's own business." Love nodded, though without enthusiasm. "What did you make of that business about Mr. Vane asking for the register?" "An interesting curiosity. Most men who care about baptisms do so for reasons of sentiment, not inquiry. I wonder which applies to Mr. Vane." They paused at the corner where the wind carried the faint aroma of pastry from the baker's shop. Purbright smiled absently. "We'll pay him a call tomorrow. It's never too soon to learn why respectable men take an interest in forgotten paperwork." Love gave a small grunt of agreement. "And Mrs. Cribbins?" "She'll write a letter tonight," said Purbright. "To whom I couldn't say, but one always writes after such interviews, either to reassure or to warn." He looked back toward the drapery building. In the upstairs window the curtain had twitched, perhaps from a draught, perhaps from human habit. The inspector's expression did not change, but he tucked his notebook into his coat pocket with unusual care. "Let's see," he murmured, "how long it takes for decency to send its reply." And as they walked away, the faint glint of the clerk's polished inkwell lingered in his mind, an oddly bright reminder that cleanliness in Flaxborough was seldom merely a matter of hygiene. Mr. Harold Vane's garden was widely admired in Flaxborough. Though the admiration was expressed in tones more cautious than generous, it was the sort of garden that discouraged praise by making it seem intrusive. Every rose bed and clipped hedge appeared to have been negotiated personally with Providence and confirmed by a committee. It was not beauty that impressed, but control. Inspector Purbright, crossing the gravel path toward the greenhouse, felt he might be entering a minor annex of the treasury. Each flower appeared to justify its existence by efficiency alone. Mr. Vane was discovered in the act of pruning a pair of silver secateurs gleaming like surgical instruments. He turned with a mild frown, as though the inspector's arrival were less unexpected than unseasonable. "Ah, Purbright, isn't it?" His voice conveyed both recognition and reservation. "I was told you might call. Something about the church, I believe." "Indeed," said Perbrite, his tone respectful, but uncommitted. "A trifling matter, I hope. Some disturbance among the parish records." Vane smiled faintly. "The church inspector has survived worse disturbances. You'll find her surprisingly durable, if occasionally untidy." Perbrite accepted the remark as one accepts weather. "The reverend was concerned, that's all. A page misplaced, a signature torn, clerical details of that sort." "Ah, Mrs. Cribbins must be in a state of ecclesiastical collapse." "She seemed distressed, yes. She mentioned, incidentally, that you once requested to see the baptismal register from 1922. Vane paused, trimming a branch with unnecessary precision. "Did she indeed? Remarkable memory, that woman. She must oil it nightly." Perbright's smile was small and non-committal. "Was there any particular reason for your interest?" "Oh, curiosity, Inspector. A family historian was writing to me about the early years of the parish. I thought it simplest to check a few entries myself." "Commendable thoroughness." "Not at all. I dislike being misquoted by strangers." The two men stood in the scented quiet. Beyond them the garden wall glowed pale against the late afternoon sun, its moss lines as deliberate as calligraphy. Somewhere nearby a lawn-mower hummed, then stopped abruptly, as though silenced by etiquette. Perbrite glanced at the flower-beds. "You must spend a good deal of time keeping all this in order." "It helps one think," said Vane, "and prevents one from being thought idle. Both are desirable conditions in a small town." "Indeed." Perbrite looked toward the house, a large, deliberate structure of red brick. "It must be satisfying to have roots here. So few families keep continuity these days." "Continuity," Vane replied, clipping another branch, "is simply the art of managing forgetfulness." The inspector regarded him with interest. "A philosophical view?" "An economical one." Mrs. Vane appeared then, walking slowly from the house. She was dressed in pale blue, which did not flatter her pallor. A small dog preceded her with the anxious briskness of one who suspects domestic unease. "My dear," she said, with the faint air of one entering a performance she hadn't rehearsed, "you didn't tell me we had visitors." "I didn't know we had," said Vane, with measured civility. "Inspector Purbright, my wife." "How do you do?" said Mrs. Vane, her hand light as paper in his. "Is it something dreadful?" "Merely administrative," Perbrite said. "No harm done, no harm suspected." "I'm relieved," she murmured, though her tone suggested that relief was not a recent acquaintance. She sat upon the stone bench near the lilac hedge, adjusting her gloves with care. Vane resumed pruning. "The inspector is investigating a missing entry. Apparently someone has tampered with the parish records." Mrs. Vane looked up sharply, then lowered her gaze to the gravel. "How extraordinary! Who would wish to do such a thing?" "Who indeed?" said Perbrite. She gave a small laugh. "It all sounds very medieval, forged documents, secret births, hidden sins." "Flaxborough has a gift for continuity, Mrs. Vane," said the inspector. "Its sins are traditional, if nothing else." She smiled faintly, but her eyes remained distant. "Then you'll find nothing new." The exchange lapsed into a mild silence. A bee circled the roses and departed. The air held a faint metallic tang, the scent of shears freshly cleaned. Vane broke the pause. "I understand the reverend was somewhat disturbed by the discovery." "He was," said Perbrite. Perhaps because it occurred on his watch, so to speak. Quite. Clergy are very proprietary about their cupboards. It's an instinct I share, Purbright said lightly. Professional pride? More a sense of order. Disorder, even in minor things, has a way of pointing somewhere. Vane straightened and turned, his pruning finished. You speak like a man who expects to find something, Inspector. Purbright smiled. Expectation is the first sign of error. I prefer suspicion. Mrs. Vane rose, brushing her skirt. You must think us very dull company, Inspector. Harold's roses receive more attention than his parishioners. His roses, said Perbrite, do not write anonymous letters. That brought a flicker to Vane's mouth. Not a smile, but a momentary tightening as if a thread had been pulled too hard. You've heard of those, have you? A few have crossed my desk. Harmless mischief, I trust. Harmlessness, said Purbright, is usually claimed by those best acquainted with harm. Mrs. Vane gave a nervous laugh, then turned toward the house. I think we'll have tea, Inspector. You'll join us? With pleasure. Inside, the drawing-room smelled faintly of lavender polish and resigned elegance. A portrait of some Victorian Vane presided over the mantel, its expression suggesting that moral certainty had once been hereditary. Mrs. Vane poured the tea with a steadiness not wholly natural. You'll take sugar? Please. Harold, do stop pacing. You make the floorboards nervous. Vane stopped pacing and stood by the window. The inspector isn't here to admire the carpet, my dear. Nor to wear it out, said Perbrite. That earned the faintest glimmer of amusement from Mrs. Vane, which vanished at once. I can't imagine what anyone would want with a baptismal record from 1922. Such things belong to the past. The past, said Vane, still at the window, has a vulgar habit of reappearing. It's like a relative with bad timing. Mrs. Vane looked down into her cup. Perhaps some people prefer it that way. No one spoke for several moments. The silence, polite and varnished, seemed to lengthen rather than deepen. Finally, Purbright said, It may comfort you both to know that no crime is suspected. Then why are you here? Asked Vane, almost lightly. To confirm that nothing criminal has occurred. That's a subtle distinction. It's what keeps my profession gainfully employed. Mrs. Vane smiled faintly, and ours tolerably amused. The tea grew cold. Purbright, setting down his cup, rose with quiet decisiveness. I won't trespass further on your afternoon. You've been most accommodating. Vane accompanied him to the door. I hope, Inspector, you'll tell Mrs. Cribbins to contain her imagination. She's capable of turning a smudge into a scandal. I'll do my best, said Purbright, though sometimes a smudge is worth looking at. At the threshold, Vane paused. You know, Inspector, it's rather unwise to dig too deeply into parish matters. The soil here's old. It may not be wholesome. Purbright adjusted his hat. That's a fair warning, Mr. Vane, but I've found that unwholesome soil often produces the most interesting growth. He stepped out into the mild sunlight. The walk back to the gate was unhurried. Purbright stopped once to examine a cluster of roses near the hedge. They were an odd colour, pale cream edged with faint brown, as though scorched by sunlight too pure to be kind. From the window above, Mrs. Vane watched him go. She stood half concealed by the curtain, one hand resting on the sill, the other at her throat. When she saw him glance back, she drew away swiftly like someone extinguishing a light too soon. Sergeant Love, waiting near the car, looked up from a newspaper. Pleasant spot, sir? Pleasant, said Purbright. In the same way a solicitor's office is pleasant. Everything grows according to precedent. Did he seem nervous? Not nervous, Purbright said thoughtfully. Cautious, as if the truth were an old cheque he preferred not to cash. Love nodded without understanding. What now? We'll call at the Gazette. I suspect the editor may know which winds blow through Mr. Vane's roses. As they drove away, Purbright looked once more through the side mirror. The house, framed by its immaculate garden, seemed too still. Not empty, exactly, but listening. And in that quiet symmetry he felt the faintest pulse of disorder, like a chord gone slightly sour. Something had been said or not said that deserved a second hearing. He made a note in his book. Vane, 1922, garden perfect, conversation less so. Then, closing the notebook, he smiled to himself. A small, professional smile that carried neither satisfaction nor relief, only the calm pleasure of a question newly born. The offices of the Flaxborough Gazette stood on a corner that had once been fashionable, though one would have to consult the borough archives to learn precisely when. The building, with its long windows and slightly arthritic drain pipes, gave the impression of observing the town with benevolent fatigue. Inside, the air smelt faintly of hot metal, ink, and a kind of civic duty that had lost its urgency decades earlier. Inspector Perbrite and Sergeant Love stood just inside the doorway, politely awaiting recognition. The receptionist, a thin woman whose hair appeared to have been ironed into obedience, regarded them without curiosity. "Mr. Parkin is in his office," she said, in the tone of one announcing a dental procedure. "You'll have to knock." Mr. Parkin, the editor, was a man of 60 who wore his cardigan as though it were a uniform of ironic endurance. His spectacles gave him a look of mild perpetual astonishment, as though every sentence in his paper were slightly longer than he'd commissioned. "Inspector Purbright," he said, rising halfway. "And Sergeant, Love. A pleasure, I suppose?" "As much as any civic obligation allows," said Perbrite. "Quite. Take a seat. I imagine you're not here to subscribe." Perbrite smiled thinly. "We rely on more direct sources, Mr. Parkin. I wanted to ask about certain matters concerning the parish." Parkin gave a small, sigh-like chuckle. "The parish? A bottomless well of rectitude and gossip. What has it done this time? There's been a tampering with the church records, 1 or 2 entries altered or removed." Parkin nodded with the calm interest of a man to whom human folly was a steady employer. "The reverend has written a letter, I presume?" "He has mentioned it, yes, but we're not sure whether the matter ends there. You see, someone went to some trouble to make it look accidental." "Ah," Parkin said, leaning back. "So, subtle vandalism. That narrows the field considerably. Here in Flaxborough, we prefer our mischief dressed in Sunday clothes." Love, who had been studying the framed front pages on the wall, turned. "Would anyone have reason to alter the records, sir? For you know, reputation." "Reputation, my dear Sergeant, is Flaxborough's most delicate industry," said Parkin. "Some protect it with silence, others with scissors." Purbright interlaced his fingers. "I understand you occasionally print a small column of parish news, births, deaths, that sort of thing?" "Of course. It keeps the congregation in touch with their mortality." "I wondered," said Perbrite, "whether any recent submission struck you as, how shall I say, pointed?" Parkin raised an eyebrow. "Pointed, Inspector? You mean malicious? Perhaps merely suggestive?" Parkin considered. "Well, there was an anonymous note slipped under the door last week, written in a hand that had been educated but later regretted it. Something about sins among the saints and truth buried deeper than the dead. I threw it out, naturally. One receives so many poetic threats when one edits a local paper." "Would you recall whether the handwriting seemed careful?" "All handwriting that reaches me is careful, Inspector. Cowardice improves penmanship." Purbright's eyes flicked to a nearby waste paper basket. "You wouldn't happen to have kept it?" Parkin looked mildly affronted. "Good heavens, no. The Gazette does not trade in anonymous hysteria." "An admirable principle," said Perbrite, "though I fear hysteria has lately become one of our parish's exports." Parkin sighed. "And yet it's always the quietest households that ship it out." There was a small pause. The faint rattle of a typewriter came from the adjoining room, where a junior reporter was likely producing his latest contribution to civic enlightenment. "Mr. Parkin," Perbrite said, "do you happen to know much of Mr. Harold Vane?" "Know of him, yes. Know him, no. He prefers it that way. A benefactor, a moralist, and an occasional advertiser. The Gazette finds that arrangement entirely satisfactory." "Did he ever write for the paper?" "Only letters," Parkin said, with a half-smile, "usually correcting the spelling of other correspondence. His generosity, like his grammar, is punctilious." Love shifted in his chair. "Would he have enemies, sir?" Parkin looked amused. "Sergeant, in a place like Flaxborough, everyone has enemies. Most of them live next door and make jam." "Still," said Perbrite, "a man who values control as much as Mr. Vane must provoke a certain discomfort." "Quite so," Parkin said. "There's a rule in small towns. One can be loved, envied, or tolerated, but never all three. Vane chose the wrong order." Perbrite nodded, reflecting. "I imagine the Gazette has chronicled his charitable efforts." "Extensively. He insists upon it. His donations arrive with press releases attached. His piety, however, prefers discretion." "Interesting," murmured Perbrite. Parkin's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. "You think there's something unwholesome beneath all that sanctity?" "I think," said Perbrite, "that in Flaxborough, sanctity is usually rented by the hour." They were interrupted by a knock. A young woman entered, carrying a bundle of proofs and an air of disciplined fatigue. Her name, as Perbrite recalled from previous acquaintance, was Miss Fallow, assistant editor, and, according to rumour, the only person in the office who still read what the paper printed. "Mr. Parkin, the layout for the parish column." She placed the papers on his desk and offered a polite nod to the inspector. "Miss Fallow," said Parkin, "the inspector has been inquiring into our more spiritual subscribers." "I can imagine," she said mildly. "Spirituality does tend to leave a paper trail." Perbrite smiled faintly. "You compile the parish notes?" "Yes, it's like weaving lace, delicate, repetitive, and ultimately pointless." "Have you ever been asked to remove or alter a notice?" Her gaze flicked to Parkin, then back to Purbright. "Occasionally, usually for reasons of tact, a misplaced adjective can ruin a widow's week." "Was Mr. Vane among those requesting alterations?" She hesitated. "Not directly, but one of his associates, Mrs. Kroom from the parish committee, telephoned last month to ask that a certain birth announcement be omitted, claimed it was a clerical error." "Whose birth?" Miss Fallowy frowned slightly. "A child named Edmund, no surname given. I assumed it was a prank and discarded it." Purbright's pencil paused above his notebook. "Did she specify why it was to be omitted?" "Only that it was unfortunate. I remember her tone. It sounded rehearsed." Parkin exhaled softly. "Mrs. Kroom is one of those women who's never surprised, just disappointed." Perbrite rose. "Thank you, Miss Fallow. You've been very helpful." "I hope not too helpful, Inspector," she said, dryly. "Around here, information is the one sin people actually notice." Outside, the afternoon had turned to a mild haze. The church spire rose over the rooftops like an upright admonition. Love followed a pace behind, still puzzled. "A birth notice, sir, in a church investigation." "Possibly related, possibly not," said Perbrite. but one learns to listen when respectable people begin editing the past. Do you think Mr. Vane's involved? Purbright considered this as they crossed the square. Mr. Vane, he said slowly, strikes me as a man who has never forgiven anyone for knowing too little about him. That can be a dangerous economy. They paused outside the tobacconist's where Perbrite purchased 2 ounces of a mild blend that seemed to reassure him. Lighting his pipe with deliberate care, he watched the thin smoke coil upward in thoughtful hesitation. "Sir," said Love, "if someone wanted to hide a birth, wouldn't they simply keep quiet? Why tamper with church books?" "Because," said Perbrite, "silence fades, but a missing record announces itself. It's the absence that people notice." Love frowned. "So they meant it to be found? Perhaps. Or perhaps they simply lacked the imagination for a better lie." They walked on, the faint smell of printing ink still clinging to their coats. The town around them moved at its usual unhurried pace, each shop and window suggesting lives carefully arranged to avoid inquiry. As they passed the churchyard gate, Perbrite slowed. His eyes followed the low stone wall, its surface mottled with age and neglect. Near the vestry door, a small figure was kneeling, a woman arranging flowers. From the distance, her blue coat made her unmistakable. "Mrs. Vane," murmured Love. Perbrite said nothing. The woman, unaware of being observed, placed a single rose upon the grass beside the wall, then rose and walked away with measured dignity. When she had gone, Perbrite stepped closer. The rose lay against the stone, its petals faintly bruised. Beside it, half buried in the grass, was a small square of damp paper, the corner of an envelope, torn and muddied. He lifted it gently. On the fragment, still legible in neat feminine handwriting, was a single word, Edmund. Perbrite stood for a long moment, the paper balanced between his fingers. "Sir?" Love asked. The inspector slipped the fragment into his notebook. "Just a name, Sergeant," he said quietly. "But in Flaxborough, names are never written down without reason." He looked toward the retreating figure of Mrs. Vane, small and precise against the lengthening shadows. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "Now why would she remember a child who never was?" The rectory at Flaxborough was a building of modest dignity, neither pious nor prosperous, but anxious to appear both. Its walls exhaled a faint aroma of old hymnals, dried flowers, and moral perseverance. The Reverend Mr. Chubb, incumbent for the past 12 years, had managed to preserve its atmosphere of benevolent weariness, a condition he regarded as preferable to enthusiasm. Inspector Perbrite arrived that afternoon, accompanied only by the sound of his own shoes on the gravel path. The sky, a mild grey, lent the day a charitable dullness. He was shown in by Mrs. Cribbins, whose expression bore the gravity of one who has spent her life discovering sins in others' handwriting. "The Reverend's in the drawing-room, sir," she whispered, as though secrecy were the highest form of courtesy. "He's expecting you. I've set out the good cups." "Much obliged, Mrs. Cribbins," said Purbright. The drawing-room looked as if it had been arranged by someone intent on denying the possibility of change. The furniture seemed too polite to be comfortable. The Reverend himself rose from an armchair beside the fire, his face long and thoughtful, his collar faintly askew, as if humility had recently been tested and only narrowly passed. "Ah, Inspector," he said, "how good of you to call. I fear our little problem with the registers continues to disturb me." "I am glad to hear it," said Perbrite. "Disturbance is often a sign that truth is trying to get through." The Reverend smiled, a gesture more resigned than amused. "I should like to believe that. But in Flaxborough, truth generally knocks once, finds no one in, and goes elsewhere." They sat. The tea arrived, conveyed by Mrs. Cribbins with an air suggesting that moral contamination might result from careless pouring. "I hear," said Perbrite, stirring his cup, "that the missing entry concerned a baptism from some years ago, 1922, I believe." "Indeed." The Reverend adjusted his spectacles. "A child named Edmund. No surname entered, which naturally is odd. Even the most discreet of sponsors seldom omit such detail." "Was there any other notation?" "Only the name of the officiating curate, a Mr. Dean. He left the parish shortly afterwards. Died, I think, in Kent." "Unfortunate timing," murmured Purbright. "Unfortunate," the Reverend agreed, "is one of those words that comfort without clarifying." Mrs. Cribbins returned, lingering unnecessarily as she rearranged the plates. "It's a mystery, that's what it is," she declared. "Some people think the devil's in the church books. I say it's the living we should be watching." "Your theological instincts are sound as ever," said the Reverend mildly. Mrs. Cribbins sniffed. "Well, Reverend, if people would stop whispering in pews and start praying, we'd have fewer problems with registers or anything else." When she had left, Perbrite said quietly, "Mrs. Cribbins seems well informed." "She is," said the Reverend. "Too well sometimes. Knowledge in her hands becomes a devotional exercise." "You've had no further disturbances in the vestry?" "None. But I did find only yesterday that someone had rearranged the parish notices pinned to the board. A trivial matter, no doubt, but curious. The sheet listing baptisms had been moved beneath the list of funerals." Perbrite looked up. "A symbolic gesture, perhaps." "Or a clumsy one," the Reverend said. "Still, in this parish, clumsiness often conceals intention." The conversation paused. Outside, the faint chime of a bicycle bell sounded across the green. Perbrite leaned forward slightly. "Reverend, forgive my persistence, but do you recall any family in the parish at that time, 1922, who might have had reason to conceal a birth?" The Reverend took his time answering. "You must understand, Inspector, Flaxborough was then, as now, a place of appearances. There were always reasons to conceal things, but yes, there was one family who attracted murmurs: the Vanes. Old Mr. Vane had returned from the war, a rather brittle man, proud, solitary. His son Harold would have been in his early 20s then. He was often seen at the rectory assisting with charity committees, offering advice where none was required. And a child? I recall nothing official, but there were whispers. A servant girl dismissed suddenly, the usual half-truths dressed in moral indignation. Would the Reverend of that time have entered such a baptism? "Dean was conscientious," said Chubb, "but he had the weakness of the young. He disliked unpleasantness. It would not surprise me if he'd agreed to omit a detail or two to preserve a parishioner's comfort." Purbright nodded. "The comfort of some is purchased by the silence of others." "Indeed," said the Reverend, with a faint smile. "A most stable currency." They were interrupted again by Mrs. Cribbins. "You'll stay for cake, Inspector?" "I wouldn't dream of imposing. It's no trouble. It was yesterday's." "That reassures me," said Perbrite gravely. She disappeared, and the Reverend gave a soft, weary laugh. "Mrs. Cribbins disapproves of anything that remains fresh too long. It undermines her sense of moral order." "She must find Flaxborough quite comfortable then," said Perbrite. A few moments later, Mrs. Cribbins returned, bearing a plate with something that looked aggressively wholesome. "Here we are, seed cake. The Reverend says it's character building." When she had gone again, Perbrite took a small, careful bite. "It certainly encourages reflection." "Indeed, usually on dental matters," murmured the Reverend. The moment of levity passed. "Reverend," Perbrite said, "you mentioned Mr. Harold Vane's charitable work. Was his involvement entirely financial?" "Not at first. He was, how shall I put it, emotionally invested. especially in the ladies' benevolent circle. He served as treasurer, though the real power lay with Mrs. Kroom. They made an effective pair. Her morality supplied the scaffolding, his money, the facade. Did they remain close? Until the usual divergence. She wanted recognition, he wanted control. Eventually, they discovered they could achieve both by disliking one another. Would Mrs. Kroom have reason to protect him? The Reverend considered this. In Flaxborough, protection and revenge often share a bed. The afternoon light had turned pale, the kind that made every object seem slightly apologetic for existing. Perbrite rose and thanked his host. The Reverend accompanied him to the porch, pausing to straighten a flower vase that leaned toward indiscipline. "Inspector," he said, "I cannot help feeling that this business of the records is less about religion than about reputation." "In my experience, the two are rarely far apart," said Purbright. The Reverend looked out across the churchyard, his eyes soft with habitual melancholy. "If one believes that sin leaves a trace, even in ink, then perhaps the torn page is a confession of sorts." "Or a reminder," said Perbrite. "Some people prefer to atone by omission." Outside, Sergeant Love was waiting by the gate, gazing gloomily at a notice advertising the autumn fair. "Plum jam competition again, sir," he said. "Same 3 entrants every year." "It's comforting to know there are constants in this world," said Perbrite. Love fell into step beside him. Did the Reverend know anything useful? Possibly a name, a memory, a tone. They're sometimes the same thing. Love scratched his head. "I can't see how an old baptism connects to the missing records, sir." "That's because you're thinking of information," said Perbrite. "This is reputation. It ripens more slowly." They walked on toward the churchyard, where the low November sun gave the gravestones the look of paper left too long in a drawer. Near the vestry wall, a figure was again at work among the flowers. Mrs. Cribbins, armed with a small trowel and the authority of the righteous, was clearing the path with unnecessary vigor. She straightened as they approached. "You've been talking to the Reverend?" she said, as though the act itself required confession. "I have." "Well, I hope you listened. He knows more than he says." Purbright regarded her with mild curiosity. "And what do you know, Mrs. Cribbins?" Her expression shifted slightly. "Enough to keep me awake, but not enough to tell anyone else. That's what comes of working for the church." "An uncomfortable blessing," Purbright murmured. "Blessing?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "If you can call it that. People think sin dies when the sinner does, but it just changes its address." She returned to her weeding. The sound of her trowel against the gravel was sharp, deliberate, and oddly final. Purbright and Love continued toward the gate. The inspector paused once to glance back. The church tower stood calm against the sky, indifferent to the small dramas below. "Sir?" Love asked quietly. Purbright adjusted his hat. "Something the Reverend said about protection and revenge. I can't decide which motive better fits our Mr. Vane." "Maybe both," said Love. Purbright smiled faintly. "Quite possibly. In Flaxborough, moral arithmetic rarely balances cleanly." As they reached the road, he drew from his pocket the fragment of envelope he'd found the day before. The word Edmund had faded slightly but remained legible. He looked at it a moment, then folded it back into the notebook. Somewhere behind them, the church clock struck 4, softly, as though unwilling to draw attention. Perbrite, staring down the quiet lane toward the Vane residence, murmured half to himself, "Perhaps it's time to see what a benefactor confesses in private." The Kroom residence was at the far end of Elm Street, a house that seemed to have been designed with moral surveillance in mind. Its windows, numerous and square, faced outward in a manner that suggested curiosity was not only welcome, but expected. A neat privet hedge marked the boundary, trimmed as sharply as the lady of the house's reputation. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived mid-morning. A soft drizzle misted the street, blurring the edges of the familiar, as though Flaxborough itself were hesitant to witness whatever transpired behind the front doors. Perbrite adjusted his hat with slow deliberation before ringing the bell, the sound echoing faintly down the narrow lane. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Kroom in her habitual dress of subdued mauve, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like a librarian guarding manuscripts. Her face, small and controlled, betrayed no surprise. In Flaxborough, one learned to anticipate the law's knock as one anticipated the weather, politely and with a measure of resignation. "Inspector Perbrite," she said, inclining her head with precise civility. "Sergeant Love, to what do I owe this pleasure?" "Good morning, Mrs. Kroom," said Purbright. "We wished to ask a few questions regarding parish records, specifically the baptism of a child named Edmund, dated 1922. Her hands tightened imperceptibly. The past, Inspector, has a way of tripping over itself. "We hope only to clarify a few minor discrepancies," said Purbright, his tone deliberately neutral. "No accusation is intended." "Of course." Mrs. Kroom's eyes remained calm, though the faint twitch of her lips suggested internal arithmetic. "Do come in. I suppose we may as well settle this comfortably." The sitting-room was small but meticulous. Every surface gleamed with an almost pious care, every object placed to enforce order rather than convenience. Mrs. Kroom gestured to two chairs beside a modest tea-table, and Perbrite seated himself with a soft rustle of coat. Tea arrived quickly, poured with the same precision one might apply to filing parish minutes. "I imagine Mrs. Vane has spoken of her own recollections," she asked, taking her seat with the poise of someone negotiating moral currency. "She has," said Perbrite, "and your name arose in connection with oversight of parish committees." Mrs. Kroom's eyes narrowed fractionally, and she raised her chin. "Oversight implies supervision. I prefer to think of it as advisory observation." "Noted," said Perbrite. "One might describe the parish as a finely balanced ecosystem in which every committee acts as both participant and regulator." She allowed a faint smile. "A poetic comparison, Inspector. Flaxborough might benefit from it." "I should like to believe so." Perbrite took a measured sip of tea, allowing the silence to gather weight. "Regarding the baptism, do you recall whether any unusual requests were made at the time?" Mrs. Kroom folded her hands neatly. "The Reverend Dean was always conscientious, though perhaps too young to resist persuasion. Some families wished discretion, others simply desired convenience, and a few sought anonymity, though I cannot recall specifics. You may have encountered one such instance?" "I might have," she said slowly. "Though anonymity in Flaxborough is always a relative term, everyone knows, Inspector, even when they do not speak." Perbrite made a small note. "And the Vanes? Any reason they would wish discretion?" Her eyes flicked to the window, as though searching for evidence in the rain. "Mr. Harold Vane is a man who prizes appearance above discussion. If an event threatened his carefully arranged image, he preferred omission to explanation. That is one of the few things we agreed upon." "And Mrs. Vane?" Perbrite asked gently. "She preferred silence," Mrs. Kroom said, her voice steady. "Perhaps she always did. It is remarkable what restraint some people consider their duty." The inspector nodded. Discretion, even decades later, can be protective or deceptive. One cannot be certain which. Mrs. Kroom's lips pressed together, almost imperceptibly. "One does what is necessary, Inspector. The parish has survived such discretion for centuries. We prefer its shadow to be unobserved. They spoke then of parish committees, charity drives, and the subtle disputes over seating arrangements at sermons. Each topic was treated with the decorum of diplomacy. Perbrite listened, noting the small tensions in phrasing, the careful selection of verbs, the pauses, the polite hesitations. Flaxborough, he reflected, was a town in which language carried as much weight as law. "You mentioned earlier," he said, "that some families sought anonymity. Were these matters ever communicated to the Gazette?" Mrs. Kroom's eyes momentarily brightened. "Occasionally, though I advised restraint. The editor tends to indulge poetic license excessively. It is not his fault. The public is hungry for gossip." "And letters?" Perbrite inquired. "Written requests, clarifications, or complaints?" "I have preserved some," she admitted, "though I rarely refer to them. A letter, once received, is either a record or a warning. Sometimes it is both." "Would you permit me to examine them?" Mrs. Kroom hesitated a beat that felt like an entire chapter of parish history. "I do not usually allow outsiders access," she said finally, "but you may glance at them under supervision." She led them to a small side room where a bureau held folders of correspondence. The envelopes were neatly labelled by date and subject. Perbrite opened one marked 1922, Baptisms, Veins, and unfolded its contents. The letter was brief, written in a careful, precise hand. It requested that the baptism of a child named Edmund be noted without parental surnames and that no further public mention be made. The handwriting suggested neither fear nor urgency, but rather meticulous determination. Perbrite read aloud slowly, "It is requested that the record be maintained in discretion to protect family reputation." Mrs. Kroom nodded. "That was my understanding. Nothing improper, merely preservation of dignity." "But the record is missing," said Perbrite, "or at least altered." Her hands folded again, almost defensively. "Then someone has failed in their duty, perhaps inadvertently, or perhaps deliberately. One cannot always distinguish the two." He looked up, noting the faint tension in her shoulders. "You have remained silent all these years?" "Silence," she said, "is often more eloquent than confession. I speak when necessary, but discretion is rarely required of the living if the dead are remembered politely." A quiet knock interrupted them. Mrs. Kroom glanced toward the door, then back at Perbrite. "That will be my housekeeper. She sometimes delivers messages from the post office. Ignore her unless she speaks of the current week." Perbrite smiled faintly. "Understood." Returning to the sitting room, Perbrite asked, "Mrs. Kroom, do you think anyone else might have been involved in the alteration?" She considered carefully. "One never knows. Some parishioners are terribly interested in reputation, others in avoiding inconvenience, and a few are simply curious." "Curious?" She allowed a faint, dry laugh. "Curiosity is often the precursor to intervention. People imagine that their small acts of oversight preserve morality, when in truth they merely rearrange consequences." Perbrite wrote this in his notebook, the phrase promising future reflection. "Then the missing record may reflect more than one hand?" "Possibly," she said, "or none. You see, Inspector, even inaction can be deliberate. Even forgetfulness may be strategic." "An interesting proposition," said Perbrite. Mrs. Kroom's eyes briefly met his. "Flaxborough, you see, has long memories and longer shadows." The conversation shifted then to practicalities, charity accounts, upcoming meetings, and the parish magazine. Perbrite observed her gestures, the gentle insistence on order, the way each sentence was a measured combination of information and omission. He noted, too, the subtle fatigue in her tone, as though decades of supervising others' reputations had become quietly exhausting. When he rose to leave, she accompanied him to the door, her expression carefully neutral. "Inspector, remember this. Sometimes the absence of evidence is the most eloquent statement." Purbright inclined his head. "I shall keep that in mind. Thank you, Mrs. Kroom. Your time and candor have been invaluable." Outside, the drizzle had lightened to a fine mist. The streets of Elm were quiet, each house wrapped in its own conscientious self-regard. Perbrite paused to examine the ground near the hedge. A small scrap of paper, partially damp, had blown from the bureau as they departed. He bent to pick it up. On it, in the same deliberate, careful hand as the earlier letter, was the single word, "vanished." He slipped it into his notebook with meticulous care, the faint weight of implication pressing lightly against the back of his mind. "Sir?" Love asked, frowning at the fragment. "Just a word, Sergeant," said Perbrite. "But in Flaxborough, words are rarely solitary. They always travel in company, even when the company is invisible." They walked slowly toward the car, the mist curling about the lampposts. Perbright's expression was composed, almost polite. Yet beneath the calm, a quiet calculation began to unfold. A name, a letter, a vanished record, and the hands that have touched them. There is more to be discovered, and discretion alone may not suffice. As the rectory disappeared behind the mist, Purbright glanced once more at the carefully trimmed hedge and murmured, almost to himself, "Now, which of Flaxborough's shadows moves with intent?" Flaxborough's primary school stood near the heart of the town, its red brick facade understated, but not unobserved. It exuded an air of polite diligence, as though every brick had been laid with consideration for both propriety and posterity. Inspector Perbrite arrived mid-morning, accompanied by Sergeant Love, noting the faintly nostalgic scent of chalk dust and varnish in the air. The headmistress, Miss Tilling, met them at the door. She was a woman of middle age, whose expression suggested that civility was both a personal accomplishment and a municipal obligation. Her gloves were as immaculate as her composure. "Inspector Purbright," she said, inclining her head, "and Sergeant Love, to what do we owe this visit?" "A question of records, Miss Tilling," said Perbrite. "We understand the school maintains a ledger of attendance and pupil details from the period around 1922. She pursed her lips. "Indeed, it is still kept. I am surprised you are consulting it, after so many years." "We are tracing the presence of a certain Edmund, sir, or rather, confirming absence or presence. Some anomalies have arisen in parish records." Miss Tilling's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, Flaxborough anomalies are as enduring as the ivy on the wall. If you wish, you may examine the ledger." The ledger rested on a large oak desk, bound in leather that had darkened with age and careful handling. Its pages were filled in tidy, near-identical script, the result of a meticulous teacher from long ago, probably one who regarded handwriting as a moral exercise. Perbrite turned the pages slowly as though fear of disruption was itself a civic duty. Each entry carried the precision of arithmetic and the subtle weight of judgment. Absences were carefully noted, newcomers registered in pencil, reflecting tentative commitment to the town's oversight. "Have you encountered a pupil named Edmund in 1922? he asked, pen poised over notebook. Miss Tilling leaned closer, her voice low. "Not by that name. There were several boys registered in that period. Edmund could have been a middle name, or perhaps used only privately." "That is consistent with the parish record," said Perbrite. "No surname entered, only Edmund." She adjusted her glasses. "Curious. We would normally require a full name. Perhaps the parents sought discretion. It was not unheard of." "And would you recall if any parent had requested such discretion. Miss Tilling hesitated a fraction of a second. I cannot say definitively. Some families insisted upon privacy, and I respected it, though we kept internal notation. We considered it a matter of trust. Purbright made a note. And the Vanes? Any students in the school at that time? She considered. Mr. Harold Vane's siblings attended, I believe. He himself, having returned from studies, would not have been present. His sisters were punctual and proper, and the Vane household always maintained appearances. Appearance indeed, said Perbrite. That seems a recurring theme. Miss Tilling smiled faintly, though her eyes remained precise. It is. Flaxborough prizes its appearances. Children are rarely allowed to disrupt them. As Purbright leafed through the ledger, he noted an entry for a boy whose surname was obscured by a smudge. The first name read Edmund, though the handwriting differed from surrounding entries, less confident, more hurried. "Miss Tilling," he said, pointing, "do you recall this boy?" Her gaze narrowed in polite calculation. That would have been an irregular enrollment. The family sought anonymity, as I suspected. The child was present for several months, then simply disappeared. No notice was given. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. "Disappeared?" Love asked, frowning. "Withdrawn quietly," said Miss Tilling. "Some families prefer discretion above procedure. One records what is necessary, omits the rest. In those days, discretion was often considered moral protection." "Protection for whom?" Perbrite asked, tilting his head. "For the family," she said firmly, "and incidentally for the child. Flaxborough had a curious way of judging by reputation alone. Public exposure could be unkind." He made another note. "And the parish? Were they aware of this irregular enrollment?" "Not formally," said Miss Tilling. "The Reverend Dean had his hands full. He trusted me to manage the school. Occasionally, he asked questions indirectly, and I provided answers selectively." "Selective answers," said Perbrite, "have a way of becoming inadvertent omissions." Miss Tilling allowed a faint, dry smile. "Indeed, omissions are often judged more harshly than mistakes. Flaxborough is precise in that regard." The inspector closed the ledger carefully. "Thank you, Miss Tilling. Your thoroughness is appreciated." "Not at all," she said, "though one learns to expect inquiries of this sort. The past, after all, seldom rests quietly. It waits, like a guest who refuses to leave." They stood, and Purbright's gaze lingered on the ledger once more. There was something about the smudged surname, the hesitant handwriting, and the abrupt withdrawal that suggested more than mere discretion, perhaps intervention, deliberate and quiet. They stepped outside into the drizzle. The schoolyard was empty, save for a few puddles reflecting the pale morning light. A blackbird hopped along the fence, disconcerted by the visitors. "Sir," Love said, squinting at the ledger, "so Edmund was here, but the parish record is incomplete. Someone erased his surname?" Purbright paused, observing the neat lines of the school facade. "It appears so, but I suspect the erasure was subtle, intended to leave the impression of a simple omission, rather than deliberate concealment. In Flaxborough, subtlety is a preferred form of moral insurance." Love frowned. "Would the Vanes have asked for that?" "Possibly," said Perbrite, "but equally possible that someone else took the initiative, someone who understood the weight of appearances and acted in what they considered the family's or parish's interest." They walked along the lane leading to the church. Purbright's mind traced connections, Van's discretion, Mrs. Kroom's careful oversight, Miss Tilling's selective record-keeping. It was as if the town itself had conspired to render a child invisible. "Sir," Love said again, hesitating, "you don't think the child's disappearance, physically, was sinister, do you?" Purbright shook his head slowly. I think it was quieter than that. It was administrative, reputational, and entirely deliberate. Flaxborough rarely requires force. It has learned to erase quietly. Love glanced at him. And the motive? Control, said Purbright. Control and comfort, both for the prominent and the careful observer. One can hide a misstep in plain sight if everyone is polite enough to ignore it. The drizzle had lightened further, leaving the town streets shimmering faintly, as though newly washed of direct scrutiny. Perbrite paused by the churchyard gate. The child's record is only part of the story. Omissions often leave traces elsewhere, in letters, in whispers, in fragments of observation. Like the envelope fragment we found? Love asked. Exactly, said Perbrite. A single word, carefully chosen, can expose the network of discretion. Edmund, vanished, recorded, remembered. Each acts as a marker, and someone watched each marker. From the church tower the clock struck 11. The sound echoed lightly, almost apologetically. Purbright's eyes lingered on the shadowed windows of the school, on the neatly ordered garden of Mrs. Kroom, and then on the Vane residence, visible in the distance. "Sir," Love said quietly. So Edmund's presence was known to the school, to Mrs. Kroom, maybe even the Vanes. But the parish records don't reflect it. Precisely, said Purbright. The child existed, but only where discretion and memory permitted. The records have been rewritten, in effect, by human politeness and the exercise of moral judgment. Love considered this. A careful system, sir. But why now investigate it at all? Perbrite gave a faint, professional smile. Because someone, recently, has reminded the town of what it hoped to forget. Flaxborough does not forgive absence quietly when attention is applied. They turned toward the car, walking slowly along the wet lane. The streets were still, punctuated only by distant church bells and the occasional whisper of wind through the hedgerows. Perbrite kept the ledger fragment in his pocket, its subtle weight a reminder of vanished presence. As they reached the vehicle, he paused, glancing back toward the school. A figure, half hidden behind the fence, had been observing them, a woman in blue, perhaps a teacher, perhaps merely a watcher. When she saw him look, she withdrew almost instantly. Purbright exhaled quietly. Someone continues to monitor, Sergeant. Not aggressively, not with threat, but with attention. That is Flaxborough's most subtle enforcement. And Edmund? Love asked. Purbright slipped the ledger fragment into his notebook. A name remembered, a record vanished, a presence marked only by absence. The question now is, who carries that memory, and what will they choose to reveal? The mist drifted between them and the school as they drove away. In Flaxborough, even the quietest ledger carried echoes, and Purbright intended to listen to each one. The Vane estate was as impeccably silent as Flaxborough could manage for a property of such prominence. Its facade, trimmed in pale stone, suggested understated wealth, while the gardens displayed a precise, almost ritualistic attention to detail. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived in early afternoon, the sky a muted grey, carrying the soft chill of approaching winter. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and well-tended hedges. They were met at the door by a butler who possessed the polished composure of one who has spent decades presiding over appearances rather than offering warmth. "Inspector Purbright, Sergeant Love," he intoned. "Mr. Vane awaits you in the drawing-room." The drawing-room itself had a restrained elegance. Deep armchairs flanked the fireplace, and the light from the large windows fell evenly across the carpet, revealing the faint imprint of decades of careful walking. Portraits of past Vanes regarded the visitors with mild detachment. Harold Vane, seated in the central armchair, rose at their entrance. He was tall, composed, and possessed a subtle air of self-regard that seemed habitual rather than conscious. His hands were folded neatly, as if prepared to receive questions rather than raise objections. "Inspector Purbright," he said, his voice calm, precise, almost rehearsed. "Sergeant Love, I trust your morning has been uneventful?" "Generally," said Perbrite, "though some historical curiosities have required our attention." "Curiosities?" Vane's brow lifted slightly. "The parish records, specifically the baptism of a child named Edmund in 1922, said Purbright. Vane's composure remained. "Ah, yes, I recall mention of that. An unfortunate oversight, perhaps. I had assumed the matter long settled." "Unfortunate," Perbrite agreed, "though in Flaxborough, even minor oversights have a way of revealing character." Vane inclined his head. "Character can be tedious when publicly examined, but by all means, Inspector, continue." They were seated, tea offered, and poured with the careful formality the Vane household maintained as a matter of civic expectation. "Mr. Vane," Perbrite began, "we understand the baptism was entered without a surname, and that subsequent parish records show discrepancies. Do you recall any reason for such discretion?" Vane sipped his tea before answering. "Discretion is often preferable. The child's mother wished privacy, a matter I respected. It was not my concern to enforce records where discretion was requested." "Of course," said Perbrite. "And yet the record seems to have vanished entirely. One might speculate that omission was exceeded by deletion." Vane's hands remained folded, his face impassive. "Speculation can be a curious exercise, Inspector. There are many people who have access to records over the decades. Any number could act, intentionally or inadvertently. It is difficult to assign intent after so long." "True," said Perbrite, "yet some omissions bear the marks of careful deliberation." Vane's gaze remained level. "And you suspect deliberate action?" "I suspect caution and concealment," Purbright said. "In Flaxborough, one rarely employs force when silence suffices." Vane allowed a faint nod. "I understand. Though I cannot speak for the past, only for my own conduct, I considered discretion necessary as I do now." There was a brief pause. Outside, the wind stirred the upper branches of the garden trees, leaving the drawing-room in soft, intermittent shadow. "Did you involve anyone else in the parish regarding this matter?" Perbrite asked gently. Vane's eyes flickered ever so slightly. "Mrs. Kroom, for instance, advised me in general terms. That is all. She has a keen sense for social propriety, and I value her judgment." "Mrs. Kroom is remarkably attentive to reputation," said Perbrite. "Indeed." "And Flaxborough requires attentiveness," said Vane. "Reputation, once damaged, lingers longer than misfortune itself." "Would she have had reason to alter records?" Perbrite probed, watching Vane closely. "Not to my knowledge," Vane said. "But she is capable of action beyond my oversight. That is the nature of careful people. They see and decide, even in my absence." "Interesting," Perbrite murmured. "So discretion, when layered with intention, can extend beyond the originating party." "Precisely," Vane said. "Sometimes protection is performed without permission. That is not uncommon in Flaxborough." Sergeant Love, who had been observing the room and the man with a cautious eye, spoke. "Sir, are you saying that someone might have acted to remove the baptism entirely, even without your request?" Vane's expression remained measured. "It is conceivable. We rely heavily upon civility here, but civility can obscure truth. Actions taken in propriety are not always those sanctioned by intention." Perbrite leaned back slightly, letting the words settle. "And the mother of the child? Did she leave any record of her wishes?" "Nothing formal," Vane said. "Her requests were private, and I honoured them. Any resulting disappearance of records was incidental to that discretion, if indeed it occurred. A soft knock interrupted them. The butler entered, carrying a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. "Apologies, sir. These arrived this morning, from the parish office, marked with some urgency." Vane took the letters, glanced at them briefly, then placed them carefully on the table. He opened the top envelope, revealing a neat slip of paper with a single word. Edmund. Purbright's eyes flicked to it. Curious. Someone within the parish still remembers him. Vane looked at the slip, then at Perbrite, expression steady but faintly thoughtful. Yes, it seems memory is more enduring than paper. Or more revealing, Perbrite said softly. Records may be erased, Mr. Vane, but human recollection has a habit of asserting itself. Vane considered this for a moment. Perhaps, though in Flaxborough, recollection is moderated by tact. One seldom allows inconvenient truths to surface. That, Perbrite said, is precisely why we must ask questions. The conversation shifted then to parish finances, charity accounts, and the careful arrangement of donor lists. Vane spoke with precision, each sentence measured to maintain dignity while revealing the faintest traces of influence. Perbrite observed every pause, every subtle inflection. In Flaxborough, power was often exercised in the smallest gestures. "Mr. Vane," Perbrite said eventually, "we are trying to determine whether the missing record was an act of individual discretion or part of a more organized effort to conceal the child's existence." Vane's hands remained folded. "It is difficult to reconstruct the intentions of decades past. I acted with propriety, as did others, I trust. Beyond that, one can only speculate." Perbrite nodded. "Indeed, and yet speculation often illuminates truth more effectively than certainty." Another silence fell, filled only by the occasional ticking of the mantel clock and the faint sound of distant church bells. Perbrite observed Vane, noting the subtle tension beneath the man's practiced calm, the way a slight tightening of fingers hinted at unspoken calculation. Finally, Vane spoke, his voice measured. "Inspector, Flaxborough thrives on discretion, but occasionally a memory persists where a record fails. You may find that the very act of inquiry evokes reactions that were dormant for decades." Perbrite made a note of this, appreciating the understated warning. "That is often the case, Mr. Vane. Records and memories do not always travel the same path." As the interview drew to a close, Vane rose, gesturing politely toward the door. "You have my time and all the information I can provide. I trust it is sufficient for your purposes." Purbright rose as well. "For the moment, yes, but one never underestimates the tenacity of Flaxborough's shadows." They walked toward the door. The butler opened it, and Purbright paused, glancing back. Vane stood by the window, the light falling evenly across his composed features, a man both present and remote, a keeper of secrets both deliberate and inherited. As they departed into the misted afternoon, Purbright's mind traced the connections: Mrs. Kroom, the school, the parish office, the missing baptism, and the faintly threatening fragment now in Vane's possession. The threads of discretion, reputation, and human memory were intertwining more tightly than he had anticipated. Sergeant Love, walking beside him, whispered, "Sir, do you think he knew about the fragment?" Purbright considered this carefully. "He certainly knows it exists, Sergeant, but whether he knows its significance or the degree to which others may be observing it is another matter entirely." They paused at the gate. A gust of wind scattered leaves along the path. Purbright picked up one, turning it slowly in his fingers. It was dry, brittle, and perfectly ordinary, yet in Flaxborough ordinary things often concealed intention. Every detail matters, he murmured. A gesture, a word, a note, and every observer matters more. He looked toward the estate one last time. The drawing-room windows reflected the muted sky, showing a man who appeared serene, yet whose eyes, Purbright suspected, were quietly measuring the world outside. "Sir?" Love asked. "Do you believe he acted to remove the record himself?" Perbrite tucked the leaf into his notebook. Perhaps, or perhaps he merely relied on others to do what he considered necessary. In this town, intervention is often indirect. Observation is the preferred instrument of control. They walked down the drive. The estate receded behind the mist, and the town continued its unhurried rhythms. But as Perbrite glanced once more at the fragment of paper, Edmund, now safely tucked in his notebook, he realized the quiet persistence of memory, discretion, and moral calculation might yet reveal the truth in ways even the most careful household could not anticipate. The parish hall, a building of utilitarian charm and habitual vigilance, stood at the far edge of Flaxborough's village green. Its windows, wide and slightly fogged, reflected the overcast sky, lending an air of muted expectation. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived just after midday, noting the faint hum of conversation within, the whispers and rustlings of a small community gathering its own truths. The hall door opened under the hand of Mrs. Kroom, who presided over parish affairs with the careful authority of one accustomed to moral oversight. She greeted them with her habitual smile, tempered by a faint tension that suggested awareness of recent developments. "Inspector Purbright," she said, inclining her head. "Sergeant Love, I trust your morning was productive?" "It has been illuminating, Mrs. Kroom," Perbrite replied. "We are following threads from earlier inquiries, and it seems they converge here." She gestured toward the hall interior. "Do come in. There are matters of record as well as discussion ongoing today. You are welcome to observe." Inside, the hall was arranged with meticulous care. Folding chairs faced a dais where the parish committee convened. Notices were pinned in neat columns. An air of procedural gravity hung over the proceedings. Parishioners chatted softly, exchanging polite commentary on charity accounts, local repairs, and the arrangement of pews for the forthcoming Advent service. Purbright and Love were guided to seats at the rear. Mrs. Kroom leaned toward Purbright. "Today's meeting is minor, yet important for context. Some recollections may surface. You will want to listen closely." The committee chairman, Mr. Trench, called the meeting to order. He spoke with gentle authority, each word chosen to preserve decorum. Discussions ranged from the allocation of flower donations to the scheduling of organists. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss, yet Purbright noted subtle tensions, a slight hesitation in Mrs. Pettigrew's speech, a too long pause before Mr. Davern's assent, the faint frown passing over Mrs. Cribbins's face. "Inspector," whispered Love, "this seems trivial." "Appearances, Sergeant," Purbright murmured. "Flaxborough's most revealing moments hide within the trivial." The conversation shifted quietly to parish archives. Mrs. Pettigrew, a woman with a reputation for precision, mentioned recent efforts to catalogue registers from the 1920s. Her tone carried the faintest unease, as if she were aware of discrepancies that might invite scrutiny. "I found some irregularities," she said softly. "Some entries appear to be missing names or dates, perhaps carelessness, perhaps—" She left the sentence hanging, allowing implication to float. Purbright's attention sharpened. He noted the subtle emphasis on perhaps the polite invitation to inference that Flaxborough favoured. "Interesting," said Perbrite aloud. "Might you specify which entries?" Mrs. Pettigrew hesitated, then named a few dates, including 1922. Edmund. The room seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Mrs. Kroom intervened smoothly. "Inspector, you must understand many of these omissions were known at the time. Discretion was exercised, sometimes in consultation, sometimes on personal initiative. It was not malicious, merely careful." Purbright inclined his head. "I understand. Yet even careful omission can create questions decades later." "Questions, yes," Mrs. Kroom agreed, "but not necessarily answers. One must be mindful of propriety before pursuing old shadows." Perbrite noted the weight in her tone. Flaxborough's guardians of morality rarely forbade inquiry outright. Instead, they suggested that prudence itself was a moral imperative. Mr. Trench returned to procedural matters, yet the tension lingered. Perbrite observed parishioners exchanging glances, some polite curiosity, others faint anxiety. The absence of any overt remark did not conceal attention. In Flaxborough, observation alone was often a more powerful instrument than accusation. During a break, Purbright approached Mrs. Pettigrew quietly. "You mentioned irregularities. Did any concern Edmund in particular?" Her lips pressed thinly. "Yes, there was a baptism recorded with a first name only. Surname omitted. I discovered it while cross-referencing with school records. The entry seems to have been purposefully vague." "Purposefully vague?" Perbrite echoed. "Yes, the handwriting differs from the usual registrar's. It is careful, deliberate, yet uncertain, as though the writer was balancing discretion against protocol." "That matches my observations," Perbrite murmured. "Was anyone else aware?" Mrs. Pettigrew's eyes flicked briefly to Mrs. Kroom, who was speaking with Mr. Davin. "Some were aware, some chose to intervene, some to defer. The record became less a matter of fact than a matter of propriety." Perbrite nodded, committing the detail to memory. "And the Vane family?" She hesitated. "Mr. Harold Vane was consulted, I believe, though how much he knew of the exact recording I cannot say. Others acted around him in the interest of discretion." "Very well," said Perbrite. "You've been helpful." As the meeting resumed, the discussion returned to flower arrangements and Advent planning. Yet the inspector noted subtle shifts. Mr. Trench's hands fidgeted slightly when parish registers were mentioned again, and Mrs. Cribbins's voice carried the faintest edge as she described proper archival procedure. During a lull, Perbrite spoke softly to Love. "Observe the way propriety functions here. Each omission, each hesitation, is a statement of control. The absence of names is itself an answer, if one knows how to read it." Love glanced around, frowning. It seemed minor, administrative, really. "Minor," Perbrite said, "is the cloak under which most Flaxborough mischief passes. Reputation is maintained quietly, interventions are subtle, yet effective." Mrs. Kroom concluded the meeting with her usual grace, reminding the committee of next week's agenda and emphasizing decorum. Parishioners filed out slowly, some exchanging measured remarks, others glancing toward the records table where the archives rested under protective glass. Once the hall was quiet, Perbrite lingered. He examined the table, noting the neat labels and the order imposed over decades. On top lay a small envelope, seemingly forgotten. He picked it up carefully. It was addressed only with the name Edmund. He turned it over in his hands. No date, no sender. Just the name, penciled in careful, deliberate handwriting. "Sir?" Love asked, stepping closer. "Observe, Sergeant," said Perbrite, "how memory manifests in Flaxborough. Even the most controlled omissions cannot entirely suppress recall. Someone wanted this noted, but indirectly, without confrontation." "Could it be from Mrs. Kroom?" Love asked. "Perhaps. or someone wishing to influence her or the record without overtly challenging authority. Flaxborough operates in shadows of suggestion more than acts of boldness. Purbright opened the envelope carefully. Inside, a single slip of paper read, "Do not forget." He allowed the words to settle. The phrasing was courteous, not threatening, yet it carried weight, the weight of moral expectation. Someone had placed it deliberately, intending observation without confrontation. Perbrite looked across the empty hall. Every surface, every chair, every pinned notice seemed to hold witness to decades of carefully controlled life. Even absence had a presence in Flaxborough. He slipped the note into his notebook. "Notice, Sergeant, the way caution travels through time. It is deliberate, yet indirect. The message is clear. Someone remembers Edmund and wishes us to remember too." Outside, a chill wind swept across the green. The leaves rustled against the hall windows. Perbrite paused, noting the footprints in the damp gravel, carefully formed, as though the person who had placed the note had departed with equal caution. "Sir," Love said, "so someone left this for us to find, but why now?" Perbrite considered. "Timing, Sergeant, is part of the message. The past in Flaxborough does not act loudly. It waits, measures, then nudges attention in the gentlest possible manner. Whoever left this has ensured it reaches the right eyes without risk." "Risk?" "Reputational risk," Perbrite said. "Or the risk of improper curiosity. The town thrives on measured observation, not overt confrontation. One act of disclosure can ripple decades of decorum." As they walked toward the car, Perbrite reflected on the converging threads: the school, the Vane estate, the parish archives, Mrs. Kroom, the fragmentary letters, and now the discreet note. Each acted as a signpost, a gentle indication of human memory asserting itself against omission. A faint movement by the hall door drew his attention. A woman, partially concealed by the shadow of the building, watched them depart. She retreated immediately when noticed, her presence fleeting but intentional. "Someone remains vigilant," Perbrite murmured. Not overtly, not aggressively, but observing. And observation in Flaxborough is often the first step towards subtle intervention. Love glanced at the envelope, now safely tucked in Perbrite's notebook. "Do you think Edmund's record will be recovered?" "Recovered?" Perbrite smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it is being reconstructed in memory alone, reinforced by careful suggestion and observation. In this town, memory is sometimes more durable than ink." They walked to the car. The mist was beginning to descend, softening edges, muting colours, as though Flaxborough itself wished to conceal nothing, yet obscure everything simultaneously. Perbrite paused once more, looking back at the parish hall. Its windows reflected the sky, empty yet attentive, and he murmured to himself, "Someone still cares. Someone has decided which omissions are intolerable, and they are guiding us quietly, deliberately, with the gentlest hand." The rectory sat at the edge of the green, its stone facade muted beneath the evening sky. The last pale light lingered on the leaded windows, casting a subdued glow over the lawn where dew already began to settle. Inside, the house was warm, infused with the faint aroma of candles and polished wood. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived as dusk gathered, bringing with them the quiet urgency of unresolved threads. Reverend Dean greeted them with measured courtesy. He was a small man of soft voice and deliberate gestures, whose calm belied an acute awareness of the town's social undercurrents. "Inspector Purbright, Sergeant Love," he said, inclining his head. "Please, come in. I have been expecting you. Tea is ready." "Thank you, Reverend," Perbrite replied, removing his coat with careful composure. "We have been piecing together information regarding parish records and the curious disappearance of the 1922 baptism entry." Reverend Dean gestured toward the sitting room, its chairs arranged with neat precision. "Yes, I am aware of the situation. It is delicate, though I trust your discretion." Purbright seated himself and surveyed the room. Books were arranged by size, papers stacked in restrained piles. The air was lightly perfumed with the smell of old ink, lending a quiet dignity to the proceedings. "Reverend," Perbrite began, "we have consulted Mrs. Kroom, the school, and the Vane estate. Each account suggests careful omission, discretion, and occasionally deliberate erasure. The question arises, who exercised the final authority over the record?" Dean steepled his hands, eyes narrowing faintly. "Authority in Flaxborough is rarely singular. We operate through consensus or at least polite acquiescence. One may propose, another may act, yet the individual's hand is seldom exposed." "So the disappearance may have been collective?" asked Love, eyebrows raised. "Not collective in the ordinary sense," Dean replied. "Rather, it was distributed. Responsibility diluted among those whose propriety we trust." Perbrite made a slow note. "And yet the child Edmund and his baptism have surfaced again, letters, fragments. The note at the parish hall. It appears someone is reminding the town of an inconvenient truth." Dean's lips pressed together briefly. "It would seem so. Yet the messenger is subtle, operating with a modicum of discretion. Perhaps they seek guidance rather than confrontation." "Or perhaps they are testing the moral memory of the town," Perbrite said softly. "After all, Flaxborough thrives on propriety, but even propriety has limits." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, one wonders how far caution may extend before silence becomes complicity." Perbrite considered the phrase. Silence, after decades, could be as binding as action. He glanced at the tea tray, noting the delicate placement of cups, the quiet ritual of hospitality. In Flaxborough, even such small gestures spoke volumes about order, control, and observation. "Reverend," Perbrite continued, "we have noticed a recurring pattern, records altered or omitted, observers maintaining oversight, reminders appearing at intervals. It suggests deliberate orchestration, though without overt accusation. Have you noticed any individuals particularly attentive to these nuances?" Dean inclined his head slightly. "Several. Mrs. Kroom, certainly. Miss Tilling at the school. Even Mr. Vane exercises influence quietly. Within the bounds of social expectation, the town has many eyes, and they often watch without comment. One does not always know which eyes are attentive until prompted." Perbrite made another note. "And the fragmentary letters, the envelope marked Edmund, the note saying, 'Do not forget.' Would you have expected such an intervention?" Dean's expression remained calm. "I would not have expected it openly, no, but discreet reminders are characteristic of Flaxborough. It is a method of enforcing moral memory without disruption, yet the timing is unusual, suggesting urgency or renewed interest." A faint knock at the door drew Perbrite's attention. Dean gestured, and Mrs. Kroom entered, her expression composed, though a flicker of concern passed briefly over her face. "Inspector, Reverend," she said, inclining her head, "I thought it prudent to deliver recent correspondence from the parish office. Nothing extraordinary, merely clarifications, but it may interest you." She handed Perbrite a small bundle of papers. He examined them carefully. Letters, notes, and memos, all lightly annotated. One envelope bore the same careful handwriting, Edmund. Purbright opened it, revealing a single line. Some memories required tending. He raised an eyebrow. Subtlety is the operative word here. Even decades later, the past asserts itself quietly. Mrs. Kroom's hands remained clasped. Indeed. In Flaxborough, one must guard propriety with vigilance. Even a minor lapse in attention may allow memory to drift unchecked. "Or compel intervention," Perbrite said, placing the note in his notebook. Someone wishes us to recognize that oversight alone may no longer suffice. That is the import of these reminders. Dean nodded. It is a delicate balance. One must allow memory to exist without undermining discretion, and yet one must also respond to the quiet insistence of what is remembered. Precisely, said Purbright. Which is why we are here tonight, to measure not just records and omissions, but the social weight that maintains them. Mrs. Kroom's gaze softened faintly, a rare concession to reflection. It is difficult, Inspector. One becomes accustomed to managing events quietly, exercising restraint and subtlety, but the longer one does so, the more a single word, a note, a slip of paper can disrupt the equilibrium. Perbrite nodded. Indeed, disruption is often achieved by the gentlest touch, a word, a memory, a fragment. It is Flaxborough's preferred method, quiet, measured, and morally suggestive. Dean rose, moving toward the window. Outside, twilight deepened, casting long shadows across the rectory lawn. Inspector, he said, voice soft, what will you do with these threads? The records, the letters, the silent witnesses? Perbrite considered the question. We will follow them, Reverend, with care. In a town such as this, discovery is not a matter of force, but of attentive observation, patience, and the interpretation of subtle signs. Each fragment has its significance, each observer a potential guide or obstacle. And the veins? Dean asked quietly. They remain influential, Perbrite said. Their interest in discretion, reputation, and propriety shapes the environment. Yet their involvement is indirect, measured. They are both custodians and subjects of Flaxborough's memory. Mrs. Kroom inclined her head. It is true. We are all measured by the care we exercise in preserving appearances and in protecting or forgetting the past. That is our responsibility, as a community and as individuals. Perbrite stood, closing his notebook with deliberate calm. Responsibility, memory, and discretion, these are the pillars upon which Flaxborough rests, yet even pillars may reveal cracks if observed closely. A moment of silence passed. Outside, a lone crow called from the distant woods, and the first stars began to glimmer faintly. Perbrite looked from the window to Dean, then to Mrs. Kroom. Both figures were composed, serene, yet the faint tension beneath their politeness was palpable, a social tremor barely concealed. I should like to review these letters more closely, Perbrite said. They may indicate which memories have been preserved intentionally and which are resurfacing now. Of course, Dean replied. The documents are at your disposal. Perbrite tucked them carefully into his notebook. He noted, too, the subtle expressions, the slight lift of an eyebrow in Mrs. Kroom's otherwise composed face, the soft tightening of Dean's lips, the precise way the shadows fell across the room. These were clues in themselves, the quiet human signals Flaxborough relied upon to enforce propriety. As they prepared to leave, Perbrite paused in the hallway. One more thing, he said quietly. The letters, the notes, the fragments, they are more than reminders. They are invitations to reflection, to discern the mechanisms of discretion. Someone is deliberately guiding observation. Mrs. Kroom inclined her head slightly. Yes, and in Flaxborough, guidance is always polite, always indirect. The hand that nudges remains unseen, yet its influence is felt. Perbrite turned toward the door. Then our task is clear. Observe, interpret, and measure carefully. Even the smallest action may reveal the largest intention. Outside, the evening had deepened into a soft, misty darkness. Street lamps cast muted halos over the damp cobblestones. Purbright and Love walked slowly toward their vehicle, the weight of the night pressing quietly upon them. Sir, Love said, breaking the silence, so the past is asserting itself. quietly, deliberately, through letters and observation? Perbrite nodded, precisely. In Flaxborough, subtlety is the preferred method of enforcement. Memory, discretion, and propriety intersect in ways that often leave the unobservant blind. But we will not be blind, Sergeant. We will follow these threads, carefully, patiently. A breeze stirred the leaves along the rectory lawn, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Perbrite's gaze lingered on the silhouette of the house, on the softly glowing windows, and he murmured to himself, "Someone still tends these memories, and one day the discretion they guard may itself point the way." As they drove away, the quiet town of Flaxborough settled into its evening rhythm, unaware that its shadows, memories, and omissions were under subtle, deliberate observation. And in the notebook Perbrite carried, the fragments of Edmund, the notes, the letters, and the faint impressions of human attention promised revelations yet to come.